Sarah's rejection by the Amish community cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. The whispers and mockery followed her like shadows, constant reminders of her status as the widow no one wanted, until he appeared. A mountain man untouched by society, who saw in her what everyone else had refused to see. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wooden wheels of horse-drawn carts rumbled across the cobblestones, filling the Sunday marketplace with their familiar symphony. Miriam Yoder adjusted her plain black dress as she navigated between stalls of hand-churned butter and woven baskets. The morning sun caught in her hair, but no amount of light could brighten the shadow that followed her through the village. "There she goes," whispered Hannah Miller to her daughter, not bothering to lower her voice. The widow with hands too rough for a proper woman. Miriam pretended not to hear, focusing instead on selecting vegetables for the week ahead. Her fingers, calloused from years of honest work, moved methodically among the produce. Once, these same hands had been praised for their skill with herbs and bread. Now, they marked her as an object of ridicule. "No man will touch her now," declared Elias loudly from his trading cart. The itinerant merchant's words carried across the square, drawing snickers from a group of young men loading grain sacks. Too sturdy to be loved, too stubborn to know her place. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any knife. Miriam clutched her basket tighter, her knuckles whitening with the effort to maintain composure. She had endured 8 months of this treatment since burying her husband, 8 months of watching former friends cross the path to avoid speaking with her. Ruth, her sister-in-law, stood among a cluster of women by the fabric stall. Their eyes met briefly before Ruth deliberately turned away, pulling her companions closer as if widowhood might be contagious. The rejection stung particularly sharp coming from family. "She thinks herself above proper mourning," Ruth murmured, just loud enough for Miriam to catch. "My brother would be ashamed." An elderly woman shifted uncomfortably at these words, but remained silent. No one dared defend the widow, not when doing so might invite similar isolation. Miriam approached the bread seller, who reluctantly took her coins without meeting her gaze. There had been a time when the baker had begged for her sourdough secrets. Now he treated her with the wary distance reserved for bad omens. Children darted around her legs, playing a game of tag through the marketplace. One small boy crashed into her skirts, looking up with momentary alarm before his mother yanked him away with unnecessary force. "Stay away from her," the woman hissed. "Misfortune follows those who lose their husbands too young." The widow squared her shoulders and continued her shopping, each step a small act of defiance. The tight-knit Amish community that had once embraced her now treated her presence as an uncomfortable reminder of mortality's unpredictable hand. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, Miriam harbored a resilience that would soon surprise them all. The marketplace fell silent, as if a spell had been cast. Jonas Keller stood at the edge of the square, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the morning light. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers replacing the usual chatter of commerce. The Virgin of the Mountain had descended. Jonas moved with the careful precision of someone more accustomed to navigating rocky paths than social gatherings. His clothes were clean but worn, homespun trousers, and a simple shirt that had seen countless seasons. The recluse rarely left his cedar cabin perched high on the mountainside, making his appearance something of a spectacle. "It's him," someone murmured, the words barely audible yet somehow filling the square. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, while men paused mid-transaction, hands still clutching coins or produce. The mountain man's reputation preceded him. Though barely 30, he had mastered survival skills that even the most seasoned Amish farmers respected. Tracking, hunting, reading weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Yet his complete avoidance of female companionship had earned him his unusual nickname and made him the subject of both ridicule and fascination. Jonas moved through the crowd with deliberate steps, seemingly oblivious to the stares. His gaze remained fixed ahead, searching until it found Miriam standing alone beside a wagon of woolen goods. The widow clutched her basket tighter as his eyes locked with hers. "What's he doing here?" Elder Abram muttered to those nearby, his authoritative voice tinged with suspicion. The elder straightened his collar, clearly unsettled by this disruption to the community's careful order. Ruth, standing with a cluster of women, snickered behind her hand. "Perhaps he's finally decided to join the living," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Though he's picked an odd day to shop." The mountain man paid no attention to these comments. He continued his steady approach toward Miriam, who remained frozen in place, her face a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The space between them seemed charged with something the onlookers couldn't name. When Jonas finally stood before her, he drew a deep breath. His voice, rarely heard in the village, carried across the now silent marketplace with surprising clarity. "I choose her," he announced, the simple declaration hanging in the air like thunder before a storm. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Elias the trader nearly dropped the goods he was showing to a customer. Samuel, working at a nearby stall, stared open-mouthed at the scene unfolding before him. Miriam herself seemed unable to comprehend the words, her eyes widening as their meaning sank in. The basket she had been clutching slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dirt. Jonas extended his hand toward her, an invitation, a challenge, a lifeline. The marketplace held its collective breath, waiting. The marketplace fell silent, every eye fixed on Jonas and Miriam. His declaration, "I choose her," hung in the air like the moment before thunder. Children stopped their play, women paused mid-conversation, and men lowered their hats in disbelief. The rhythm of community life, as predictable as the seasons themselves, had been disrupted by 4 simple words. Miriam Yoder stood frozen, her worn black shoes suddenly the most interesting thing in her world. Her heart fluttered wildly in her chest, a trapped bird seeking escape. After 2 years of widowhood, of sidelong glances and whispered mockery, this mountain man had singled her out. She dared not look up, afraid to find this was merely another cruel jest at her expense. "This cannot stand." Elder Abram finally broke the silence, his weathered face creased with concern. The custodian of ordning stepped forward, Bible-calloused hands gripping his suspenders. "Jonas, you have lived apart from us too long. You cannot simply descend from your mountain and upset our ways." Jonas merely shrugged, unmoved by the elder's authority. "The Lord guided my steps today," he said, his voice awkward but determined. "I have chosen." Whispers rippled through the gathering. Some nodded in approval, mostly the younger folk who secretly admired Jonas's independence. Others crossed their arms in judgment, Ruth chief among them, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. That evening, as Miriam packed her few belongings, her hands trembled. She folded her second dress carefully, wondering what life with this stranger might bring. Hope and terror mingled in her chest. Would this be her redemption or her final shame? Across the village, Elder Abram consulted with the other church leaders by lantern light. "This union threatens everything we stand for," he insisted. "Jonas has never submitted to baptism, and Miriam's standing is complicated." "But we cannot forbid it outright," another elder cautioned. "The Ordnung speaks of marriage as sacred." "Then we watch and wait," Abram decided. "The year ahead will test them both." As dawn broke, Miriam stood at the edge of the village, a small bundle clutched to her chest. Jonas appeared on the path, leading a cart pulled by a sturdy horse. No words passed between them as he helped her aboard, his calloused hands gentle but uncertain. The wheels creaked as they began their journey up the mountain path, away from the only community Miriam had ever known. Behind them, villagers watched from doorways and windows, some with scorn, others with curiosity, and a few with secret envy. The year ahead would test not just Jonas and Miriam, but the very fabric of tradition that held their world together. The narrow path twisted upward through dense pines, each step taking Miriam further from the scornful eyes of the village. Jonas Hirschberger walked ahead, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as if bearing an invisible weight. Neither spoke as they climbed, the only sounds their labored breathing and the occasional crack of twigs beneath their boots. After nearly an hour, the trees parted to reveal Jonas's cedar cabin, perched on a natural ledge overlooking the valley. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, dancing against the afternoon sky. "It's not much," he mumbled, fumbling with the wooden latch. The door swung open, releasing the mingled scents of cedar, wood smoke, and something herbal, perhaps rosemary or sage. Miriam stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The single room was sparse, but meticulously organized. A hand-carved table stood beneath the window, surrounded by two mismatched chairs. A narrow bed occupied one corner, its quilt pulled tight with military precision. Herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, and a small iron stove radiated welcome heat. "You've made this beautiful," she said softly, noticing how the recluse averted his eyes when she spoke directly to him. The mountain man moved awkwardly around his own space, suddenly conscious of its limitations. "The goats need milking," he said abruptly, gesturing toward the small barn attached to the cabin's northern wall. In the days that followed, they established an unspoken rhythm. Jonas would rise before dawn to hunt or check his traps, while Miriam tended the garden and small livestock. Her experienced hands coaxed new life from the soil, planting rows of herbs she recognized from her previous life in the valley. By the second week, the widow had reorganized the pantry, expanded the herb garden, and begun producing goat cheese that even Jonas admitted was superior to his own attempts. Her practical knowledge transformed the isolated homestead into something approaching prosperity. "You know more than I expected," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. Miriam's hands never stopped working, twisting fibers into twine. "I've always known how to make something from nothing," she replied. "That's how widows survive." Down in the village, tongues wagged ceaselessly. Elder Abram expressed concern that Jonas had chosen Miriam not from genuine affection, but as an act of rebellion against community norms. Ruth, still bitter, spread whispers that her sister-in-law had bewitched the Virgin of the Mountain with some unholy charm. "He'll tire of her soon enough," Elias predicted as he unloaded his trading wagon in the marketplace. "A man like that doesn't suddenly change his nature." But on the mountain, change was happening nonetheless. Each night, Jonas and Miriam moved their chairs incrementally closer to one another, two solitary souls learning with hesitant steps how to share a life neither had imagined possible. The first barn raising of the season brought the entire Amish community together in a display of unified purpose. Men climbed wooden frames while women prepared food, each person filling their appointed role with practiced efficiency. Miriam stood awkwardly at the periphery, her black widow's dress marking her as clearly as a brand. Though her hands were skilled and strong, the other women kept their distance, offering only curt nods when necessity demanded interaction. "Keep the widow away from the bread," Ruth whispered loudly enough for Miriam to hear. "Her touch might sour the dough." The comment drew snickers from several women, who glanced at Miriam with undisguised disdain. Miriam kept her eyes down, focusing on slicing apples with methodical precision. She had attended dozens of barn raisings before, but never had she felt so unwelcome. From across the field, she caught sight of Jonas hammering alongside the other men. Though clearly uncomfortable with the social demands, he worked steadily, his strong arms driving nails with practiced efficiency. As midday approached, the framework stood nearly complete. The community gathered beneath the new beams for the traditional midday meal and songs. Elder Abram led the group in prayer, pointedly avoiding any glance toward Miriam or Jonas as he thanked the Lord for community and tradition. When the meal concluded, several young women began a hymn. The singing spread through the gathering, voices rising in familiar harmony. During a brief pause between verses, Miriam, perhaps driven by loneliness or a desperate need to belong, raised her voice. The clear, powerful notes silenced the crowd. Her voice carried across the field, rich and pure, filling the spaces between the newly raised beams. Miriam sang words of hope and perseverance, her eyes closed as if drawing strength from somewhere beyond the judgmental stares. For several heartbeats after she finished, no one spoke. Even Ruth seemed momentarily stripped of her sharp tongue. Naomi, seated near the back, nodded with quiet approval, a small smile playing at her lips. Jonas, standing apart from the other men as usual, felt an unexpected swell of emotion. Was this stubborn pride in his choice, or something deeper? He had selected Miriam partly to defy the community's cruelty, but watching her now, dignified despite her isolation, stirred feelings he couldn't easily name. "The widow has a voice," someone finally murmured, breaking the silence. "A voice won't warm a bed or bear children," Ruth countered, but her words lacked their usual venom. As the community returned to work, Jonas caught Miriam's eye across the distance. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that somehow felt more significant than any words they had yet exchanged. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not quite love, perhaps, but a recognition that their unusual arrangement might contain unexpected depths. The first blossoms of summer painted the valley in delicate hues, but beneath this beauty, something darker was taking root. Ruth Yoder stood in Elder Abram's sparse office, her fingers twisting nervously at her apron, as sunlight streamed through the simple window. "She's changing him," Ruth insisted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonas was odd before, but he respected our ways. Now Miriam has him questioning everything." The bitterness in her tone betrayed more than concern for tradition. Since her brother's death had left Miriam a widow, Ruth had enjoyed elevated status as the family's moral compass. Now, with her sister-in-law finding unexpected acceptance, that position felt threatened. Elder Abram nodded gravely, stroking his gray beard. The community leader had watched the unusual pair with growing unease. The Virgin of the Mountain was strange, but harmless. This union disrupts the natural order. He shuffled papers on his desk, records of community transgressions that seemed to multiply since Jonas had brought the widow to his cabin. "They say she's teaching him things," Ruth continued, her implication hanging heavy in the air. "No decent woman would know." Outside, the marketplace hummed with activity as Elias Miller unpacked his wagon of treated goods. The itinerant trader moved between Amish communities, carrying not just wares but words, whispers that traveled faster than his horse-drawn cart. "Saw them myself," Elias told a cluster of young women examining his fabrics. "The mountain man barely looks at her. Took her in like you take in a stray dog, out of pity." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Mark my words, there's nothing natural between them." By midday, the story had transformed. Some said Jonas had chosen Miriam as penance for unnamed sins. Others whispered he'd been bewitched by her widow's bread. The tales grew wilder with each retelling, weaving through the community like poison vines. Samuel, working at the community mill, overheard the whispers with growing discomfort. He'd helped Miriam grind flour in secret and knew the gentleness in her hands, the quiet dignity in her movements. These stories matched nothing of the woman he knew. As evening approached, Naomi caught sight of Miriam herself, walking alone to gather herbs at the forest's edge. The older woman noticed how the widow's shoulders had straightened in recent months, how her steps carried new purpose. Whatever was happening in that cedar cabin on the mountain, it wasn't the corruption Ruth feared. The community, once bound by shared purpose, now divided into factions, those who condemned, those who wondered, and the few who dared to hope. Beneath the surface of daily chores and prayers, suspicion bubbled like a pot left too long on the fire, threatening to boil over and scald them all. The cedar logs crackled in the stone hearth as thunder rolled across the mountains, shaking the cabin's sturdy frame. Miriam Miller sat quietly, her fingers working a piece of mending as rain began to patter against the windows. Jonas watched her from across the room, his usually stoic face troubled by something unspoken. "The storm reminds me of the night my father passed," he said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. "I was 15 then, learned to survive alone after that." Miriam set her sewing aside, sensing the weight behind his words. "You've done well for yourself," she offered gently. Jonas moved closer, settling awkwardly beside her on the bench. His calloused hands twisted together, betraying his nervousness. "There's something I should tell you," he began, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Something the village mocks me for, though they don't know the truth of it." The widow nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've never—" Jonas paused, searching for words. "That's why they call me the Virgin of the Mountain. It's true, but not for the reasons they think." His eyes met hers briefly, before darting away. "It wasn't rebellion or oddness that kept me apart. I simply never felt," he gestured vaguely, "whatever it is that draws people together." Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, vulnerable and earnest in the momentary brightness. "Until now," he added quietly. Miriam felt her heart quicken, but kept her expression measured. She had known ridicule and judgment too well to dismiss his confession lightly. "The elders believe I chose you out of defiance," Jonas continued, finding courage in her silence. "Ruth tells everyone I took you from pity. Elias spreads worse tales at market." He shook his head. "None understand that I saw in you something I recognized, someone who stands apart yet remains strong." The recluse reached tentatively toward her hand, but stopped short of touching it. "I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know if I can ever be what others expect. But I know what I feel when you're near is genuine, not obligation." Miriam studied him carefully, seeing beyond the awkward mountain man to the gentle soul beneath. For months, she had wondered about his motives, questioned whether she was merely a statement against the community that had rejected them both. "We have time," she finally answered, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. "Whatever comes between us should grow naturally, like your herbs in the garden." She closed the distance between their hands, her fingers lightly covering his. "I've had enough of the village's expectations to last a lifetime." Outside, the storm continued, but within the cedar cabin, something fragile and hopeful had taken root. The quilting circle gathered in the community barn every Thursday afternoon, a tradition as old as the settlement itself. Miriam hesitated at the entrance, clutching her sewing basket tightly against her chest. The last time she had joined, before her husband's passing, she had been welcomed warmly. Now, she felt the weight of scrutiny as she stepped through the door. Several women shifted uncomfortably, their needles pausing mid-stitch. Others continued their work, pretending not to notice her arrival. Only Naomi, with her weathered hands and kind eyes, motioned for Miriam to take the empty seat beside her. "We're working on the community quilt," Naomi explained, her voice carrying enough to silence the whispers. "Each woman chooses a pattern that speaks to her heart." Miriam nodded, carefully unpacking her needles. The fabric squares before her seemed to hold infinite possibilities. While the others had selected traditional motifs, stars, baskets, and wedding rings, her fingers were drawn to a different pattern. "Doves," Naomi observed, watching as Miriam traced the outline onto her square. "An interesting choice." The widow's hands moved with surprising grace, her stitches even and deliberate. Years of practical sewing had made her fingers nimble, and soon the outline of two doves took shape, their wings touching in gentle communion. "My grandmother taught me this pattern," Miriam explained softly. "She said doves carry messages between heaven and earth." A few of the younger women leaned closer, curiosity overcoming their reservations. Miriam's needle danced across the fabric, bringing life to the birds with each careful stitch. The afternoon light streamed through the barn windows, catching the thread as it pulled through the cloth. "There's meaning in your choice," Naomi whispered when the others were distracted by Ruth's arrival. The elder woman's eyes held a knowing gleam. Doves return even after great floods. They find land when others see only water. Miriam's hands stilled momentarily. "I didn't think of it that way." "Your widowhood," Naomi continued, her voice barely audible, "may conceal a blessing yet to be revealed, like the dove that returned to Noah with an olive branch." The quilting continued through the afternoon, the women's conversation flowing around Miriam like water around a stone. Yet something had shifted. As her square took final form, several women paused to admire the craftsmanship. When the completed square was added to the growing quilt, its meaning seemed to ripple outward. The doves stood out among the traditional patterns, not garish, but undeniably present. Like Miriam herself, as they packed away their supplies, one of the younger women approached. "Would you show me that stitch sometime?" she asked hesitantly. Miriam nodded, a small smile warming her face. The quilt would hang in the community hall for all to see, her message stitched permanently into the fabric of village life. The late summer air hung heavy with the scent of ripening wheat as the village buzzed with preparations for the annual Harvest Hymn Festival. Women swept doorsteps, while men erected wooden platforms in the festival grounds, where the community would gather to sing praises for the season's bounty. For generations, this celebration had united the community in gratitude and fellowship. Every voice valued as part of the collective harmony. Every voice except Miriam's and Jonas's. Elder Abram had made the announcement after Sunday service with practiced solemnity. "The choir roster has been finalized," he declared, his eyes deliberately avoiding the corner where Miriam stood in her black dress. The list of names, read aloud, conspicuously omitted the widow and her mountain man, a public declaration of their continued status as outsiders. "It's tradition," Ruth whispered loudly enough for nearby women to hear. "Those who live outside our ways cannot lead us in sacred song." Her satisfaction was poorly disguised as piety. The exclusion stung Miriam more deeply than she expected. Before her husband's death, her voice had always been welcomed in the choir, praised even. Now, she found herself walking home alone, Jonas silent beside her, both carrying the weight of rejection. The following morning, as Miriam sat on her porch contemplating what to do with the festival days ahead, Samuel appeared at her gate. The young farmhand shifted nervously from foot to foot, his straw hat clutched in calloused hands. "I've brought something," he said, revealing a sack of premium wheat berries. "The best from our field, for grinding." Miriam studied his earnest face. "Why would you risk bringing this to me?" Samuel glanced over his shoulder before stepping closer. "My mother always said your bread was touched by angels. I thought maybe you could still be part of the festival, in your own way." In the privacy of her kitchen, Samuel helped Miriam grind the wheat, the stone wheel turning rhythmically under their combined effort. As they worked, words tumbled from him, how he'd always admired her resilience, how unfair the village had become. "I wish I could speak up for you," he confessed, eyes downcast. "But I'm not brave like Jonas." Miriam touched his arm gently. "Courage comes in many forms, Samuel. Even in a sack of wheat brought to a widow's door." He left before anyone might notice his absence, promising to return with more supplies. Miriam watched him go, knowing his small act of kindness wouldn't change her exclusion from the festival, but finding comfort in the reminder that not every heart in the village had hardened against her. The Harvest Hymn Festival arrived with the crisp air of early autumn. While Elder Abram led the congregation in traditional songs, Miriam Yoder worked in the small kitchen behind her cabin, hands deep in dough. The familiar motions brought comfort as she kneaded and shaped the bread, using recipes passed down through generations of her family. The scent of baking bread drifted through open windows, carrying across the festival grounds. 3 young women, wives barely a year into their marriages, hesitated at her doorstep before gathering courage to knock. "We shouldn't be here," whispered one, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Miriam wiped flour from her hands. "Come in quickly, then," she said, ushering them inside. The youngest, Sarah, spoke first. "My bread never rises properly. Everyone says yours is the best in the county, even if they won't admit it openly." Miriam smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in public since Jonas had chosen her. "Watch," she instructed, demonstrating how to knead with the heel of her hand. "The secret isn't just in the ingredients, but in how you handle the dough." As the hymns continued in the distance, more women appeared at her door. 5, then 8. They crowded around her wooden table, watching intently as she added a pinch of dried herbs from a small pouch. "What is that?" asked Rebecca, Elder Abram's niece, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Something my grandmother taught me," Miriam replied. "It strengthens the body and soothes the spirit." The women exchanged glances. This wasn't the dangerous widow they'd been warned about, but a woman with knowledge worth preserving. When the bread emerged golden from the oven, Miriam sliced it carefully. "Take some back," she suggested. "Share it, but discreetly." They wrapped warm pieces in cloth napkins, tucking them into apron pockets before slipping away to rejoin the festival. Throughout the afternoon, the aroma of Miriam's bread competed with the solemn hymns. Women passed portions to children and husbands, who closed their eyes in appreciation. Even Ruth, passing by with narrowed eyes, couldn't help but notice how her own children eagerly accepted pieces from their friends. Jonas found Miriam later, standing at the edge of the gathering. "Your bread has caused quite a stir," he said quietly. She watched as the community shared her creation, passing it from hand to hand like a secret message. "Bread has a way of speaking when words fail," she replied. That evening, 3 more women appeared at their cabin door, asking if Miriam might teach them again tomorrow. In their eyes, she saw not the mockery she'd grown accustomed to, but something new: respect. The first frost came early that year, painting the fields with silver and dimming hopes for the autumn harvest. As villagers gathered their meager crops, a whisper of fear spread through the community faster than the morning mist. Baskets that should have overflowed with abundance held only disappointment, and the specter of winter hunger loomed large in everyone's mind. Elder Abram stood before the gathered families at the council hall, his weathered face grave in the lantern light. "We must consider what has brought this misfortune upon us," he announced, his voice carrying across the anxious crowd. "Since the widow came to live among the mountain folk, our blessings have diminished." Miriam sat beside Jonas, her fingers twisting the fabric of her black dress. She felt the weight of accusation pressing down upon her shoulders, as surely as if stones had been placed there. The elder's words weren't surprising. She had sensed the growing resentment with each withered stalk pulled from the ground. "The ordinum is clear," Abram continued. "Those who bring discord and misfortune cannot remain within our protection." Ruth pushed forward through the crowd, her eyes bright with vindication. "My brother's widow has brought strange practices into our midst," she declared. "I have seen her whispering over the bread dough, using herbs no decent woman would touch." The sister-in-law's words sparked murmurs of agreement. "The bread she shares, it isn't right," Ruth continued. "My children ate it and spoke of strange dreams. This is not our way." Jonas rose to his feet, awkward but determined. "Miriam has brought nothing but good to my home," he said, his voice unsteady with the effort of public speaking. "Our stores are full while yours dwindle. Perhaps you should ask why." "Because you live apart," someone shouted. "Because she has corrupted you with her widow's ways." Miriam finally stood, her sturdy frame straight despite the trembling in her heart. "I use the herbs my grandmother taught me," she said quietly. "The same herbs that grow on these hills, given by God's hand." But her words fell on deaf ears. Ruth had seized her moment perfectly. channeling the community's fear into a weapon against her rival. Families who had secretly enjoyed Miriam's bread now averted their eyes, unwilling to stand against the tide of accusation. As they walked home through the gathering darkness, Jonas took Miriam's hand, a rare gesture of public affection. "They fear what they don't understand," he said simply. "And what they fear, they seek to destroy," Miriam replied, her voice steady despite everything. She knew that the coming days would test not just her baking skills, but her very right to exist among these people. The battle lines had been drawn with flour and fear, and she would need all her strength to withstand the storm. The village meeting hall buzzed with accusations as Elder Abram stood before the gathered families, his finger pointed squarely at Miriam. The harvest's failure, he claimed, was divine punishment for harboring a widow whose presence invited misfortune. "Her bread rituals mock our ways," Ruth declared, her voice carrying across the room. "My own children refuse to eat proper food after tasting her corrupted loaves." The murmurs grew louder until Naomi, her gray hair neatly tucked beneath her prayer cap, rose slowly from her bench. The room fell silent as the respected elder woman made her way to the center. "I have lived through 63 harvests," Naomi began, her voice steady despite her age. "And I recognize blessing when I see it. Miriam's knowledge of herbs and grains isn't witchcraft. It's wisdom passed through generations of faithful women." Several younger mothers nodded, remembering how Miriam's tinctures had eased their children's winter coughs when nothing else would. "The poor harvest comes not from her presence, but from the bitterness we've planted," Naomi continued, looking directly at Ruth. "Perhaps God tests not Miriam's worthiness, but our capacity for kindness." Elder Abram shifted uncomfortably as whispers rippled through the gathering. The old woman's words carried weight that even he couldn't easily dismiss. Meanwhile, miles away, Jonas trudged through the forest, tracking prints in the early snow. 3 days he'd been hunting, determined to provide for the winter ahead. When he finally returned to the cedar cabin, he dragged behind him a massive elk, enough meat to see them through the coldest months. Miriam worked tirelessly for days, her strong hands expertly butchering, smoking, and preserving every usable part of the animal. Nothing went to waste. She rendered fat for candles, stretched sinew for thread, and packed the meat with herbs that would keep it flavorful through winter. Word of their bounty spread quickly. Samuel, passing by on his way to chop firewood, glimpsed the smokehouse filled with hanging meat, and told his mother, who told her sister, who whispered it to the baker's wife. "They'll have food when others go hungry," people murmured, their tone shifting from mockery to something closer to respect. When 3 families found small parcels of smoked meat on their doorsteps, families with many children and little to spare, suspicion turned toward Miriam and Jonas, though neither claimed responsibility. "Perhaps," Naomi suggested to the quilting circle, her needle flashing in the afternoon light, "we've been too quick to see curse where blessing grows. The widow and the mountain man might be exactly what our community needs to survive this winter." The women bent over their work, silent but thoughtful, as outside the first heady snow began to fall. The first snow fell like a judgment, heavy and uncompromising. By morning, the Amish village lay buried under a thick white blanket that transformed familiar paths into treacherous mysteries. Families huddled in their homes, counting preserved jars and wondering if their stores would last through the bitter months ahead. High on the mountain, Jonas and Miriam's cedar cabin stood defiant against the winter's assault. While others worried, their pantry shelves sagged with the weight of abundance. The elk meat Jonas had hunted hung in perfect strips, smoked and preserved by Miriam's skilled hands. Her bread, rising in steady batches, filled the small home with an aroma that seemed to ward off the very cold itself. "The snow will keep coming," Jonas remarked one evening, his large frame silhouetted against the fireplace as he added another log. His voice had lost some of its awkwardness in the months they'd spent together. "But we are ready." Miriam nodded, her fingers working a new quilt. The widow had learned to read his sparse words, finding comfort in their simplicity. "More than ready," she replied, glancing at their well-stocked shelves. Their evenings had fallen into a gentle rhythm, Jonas tending the fire while she sewed or prepared herbs, sometimes reading aloud from one of the few books he kept. The isolation that had once been their burden had transformed into a blessing. No mocking voices, no sidelong glances, just the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Word spread through the community that the mountain man and his scorned wife were weathering the winter with surprising ease. Children whispered that smoke always rose from their chimney, and light glowed in their windows long after other homes went dark to conserve candles. One particularly harsh evening, Elias the trader struggled through the snow to their door, his usual gossip frozen on his lips as he accepted their hospitality. He departed with a bundle of Miriam's herbs and the tale of their cozy home on his tongue. "They sit up there like king and queen," he told the gathered men at the community store the next day. "Warm as summer, with food enough to share." His words carried no malice now, only a reluctant admiration. Even Ruth, peering through her frosted window at her dwindling supplies, found herself thinking of her sister-in-law with something other than contempt. The widow she had helped ostracize now seemed touched by providence. Elder Abram listened to these reports with growing unease. "Pride comes before destruction," he reminded those who would listen. "Their isolation is not to be envied." But as the winter deepened and hunger gnawed at the edges of the community, many found themselves looking up toward the mountain cabin with longing. The couple's separation from the village, once a mark of shame, had become their salvation. In the quiet of their hearts, some wondered if they had been wrong about Miriam all along. The winter candle vigil arrived with the first heavy snow, a tradition as old as the settlement itself. Every Amish family placed carefully crafted beeswax candles in their windows. The soft glow meant to guide lost souls and wandering spirits safely through the darkness. This year, as ice crystals formed intricate patterns on window panes across the village, Miriam's candle burned with unusual brilliance. "It's brighter than all the others," whispered 8-year-old Sarah Lapp, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she stood with several other children, gazing up at the mountain cabin. Jonas had crafted the candle himself, using beeswax from their own hives and a special blend of herbs Miriam had suggested. The flame seemed to dance with unusual vigor, casting a warm golden light that stretched far beyond their cedar home and down the snowy path. "My mother says we shouldn't come here," confessed Jacob Miller, the youngest son of the blacksmith. "But I feel warm when I look at the light." One by one, more children gathered beneath the window, drawn like moths to the unusual radiance. Miriam noticed them from inside and stepped onto the porch, her black dress a stark contrast against the snow-covered landscape. "Would you like some warm bread?" she asked, her voice gentle. The children nodded eagerly, momentarily forgetting their parents' warnings about the widow. Inside, as they huddled by the hearth, one little girl clutched Miriam's hand. "My grandmother says your candle burns so bright because you have a pure heart, no matter what others say." Jonas watched from the corner, awkward but pleased, as his once empty home filled with childish laughter. The recluse, who had never known how to speak to others, found himself smiling at their innocent chatter. Word spread quickly. By nightfall, Elder Abram called an emergency meeting at the council hall. "This is dangerous superstition," he declared, his beard quivering with indignation. "Children claiming they feel protected in the presence of that woman? This undermines our traditions." Ruth nodded vigorously. "My own nephew came home speaking of miracles and special candles. This is exactly the corruption I warned about." Naomi, sitting quietly among the women, finally spoke. "Perhaps we should ask why the children feel drawn there. Is it corruption they seek, or something our community has forgotten to provide?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but unsettling. Even as the elders drafted a formal warning against visiting the mountain cabin, parents noticed their children's unusual calm after returning from Miriam's presence. "There's something different about her candle," Samuel admitted reluctantly to his father. "Something that makes you believe things might turn out right, even in the darkest winter." The elders might dismiss it as superstition, but the children's trust in Miriam had planted a seed that would not be easily uprooted. The blizzard descended without warning, transforming the peaceful Amish village into a treacherous white void. Wind howled between buildings, erasing paths and blurring boundaries. Amid the chaos, Ruth's youngest son Eli had wandered from the warmth of their home while she argued with neighbors about Miriam's growing influence. When the child's absence was discovered, panic gripped the community. Men gathered with lanterns, their bearded faces grim against the stinging snow. Ruth's screams carried across the village square, her previous malice forgotten in maternal terror. Jonas heard the commotion from his cabin. Without hesitation, he donned his thickest coat and ventured into the storm. The mountain man knew winter's dangers better than anyone, having survived 15 solitary seasons on the mountainside. He tracked the boys' faint footprints before they vanished completely, following instinct more than sight. Nearly 2 hours passed before Jonas emerged from the whiteout, the small body of Eli clutched against his chest. The child's lips had turned blue, his eyelashes frosted white. Without a word to the gathered crowd, Jonas strode past Ruth and carried the boy directly to his cabin, where Miriam waited. "His heart still beats," Jonas said, laying the child on their bed, "but barely." Miriam sprang into action. Her strong hands worked methodically, removing wet clothes and wrapping Eli in warmed blankets. She crushed dried herbs from her carefully labeled jars, brewing a tea with honey and placing it to the boy's lips. Her movements betrayed years of knowledge, wisdom passed through generations of women who had fought winter's grasp on fragile lives. "Hold him close," she instructed Jonas, who awkwardly cradled the child against his chest for warmth. Ruth burst through the door moments later, her face contorted between gratitude and lingering resentment. She watched in silence as the widow, the woman she had mocked and accused, worked tirelessly to save her son. By morning, color had returned to Eli's cheeks. The boy smiled weakly at Miriam as she fed him another spoonful of broth. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice cracked with emotion. "You saved him when I could not." The words hung in the air, an admission that cut through months of cruelty. Outside, villagers gathered to hear news of the child. The story spread quickly. How Jonas had risked himself in the blizzard, how Miriam's herbs had pulled the boy from death's edge. Samuel, standing among the crowd, spoke what others only thought. "Perhaps we've judged too harshly." Even Elder Abram remained silent, unable to dismiss the evidence before him. The rescue became a turning point. Not a complete transformation, but a crack in the wall of rejection that had surrounded Miriam since Jonas first chose her. Compassion, it seemed, spoke louder than gossip in the aftermath of the storm. The first warm breeze of spring swept through the valley, melting snow from rooftops and coaxing green shoots from the soil. With the thaw came a reckoning. The Ordnance Council, led by Elder Abram, assembled in the community hall. Their faces set with stern determination. Word had spread quickly through the village. This meeting had one purpose: to formally expel Miriam from their community. The hall filled with villagers, some whispering behind cupped hands, others standing in uncomfortable silence. Miriam entered with her head held high, her widow's dress now adorned with a small dove pin, a quiet symbol of her defiance. Jonas walked beside her, his large frame awkward among the crowd, but his presence unwavering. "We have gathered to address the corruption of our ways," Elder Abram announced, his voice carrying across the room. "This woman has brought strange practices among us. Her bread, her herbs, the children gathering at her window. These things are not our way." Ruth nodded vigorously from her seat near the front, her eyes gleaming with vindication. Several other elders murmured their agreement, their weathered hands gripping their chairs with righteous tension. "The council recommends immediate separation," Elder Abram continued. "She must leave our lands before the planting season begins." A hushed tension fell over the gathering. Even those who had mocked Miriam seemed unsettled by the severity of the judgment. Naomi, seated near the back, shook her head slowly, her wise eyes filled with disappointment. Then Jonas stepped forward. The mountain man who rarely spoke now stood before the entire community. His hands, calloused from years of solitary survival, trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I chose her," he said simply, "not out of pity or rebellion. She is not a burden to be cast aside, but the heart I have chosen." His words, unpolished but sincere, rippled through the crowd. Several women exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Even Samuel, standing near the door, straightened his posture, something resolute forming in his usually timid demeanor. "The ordinum speaks clearly," countered Elder Abram, though with less certainty than before. "Traditions protect us. Without them, we are lost." "Without compassion, we are already lost," Jonas replied, his hand finding Miriam's. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, caught between tradition and the undeniable truth before them. Some nodded in agreement with Jonas, while others clung to old resentments, their faces hardened against change. The council members exchanged troubled glances. What had seemed a straightforward judgment now balanced precariously on the edge of community division. The outcome hung in the air, suspended between mercy and tradition, as loyalties and long-buried secrets threatened to break the surface. The council hall fell silent as Samuel pushed through the crowd, his hands trembling but his steps determined. The young farmhand, usually content to blend into the background, now commanded everyone's attention. His face flushed with a courage few had witnessed before. "I have something to say," Samuel announced, his voice cracking slightly before finding strength. "What you're accusing Miriam of isn't true." Elder Abram rose from his seat, his authoritative presence attempting to quell the interruption. "This is not the time for—" "I saw you," Samuel continued, pointing directly at the elder. "3 nights ago by lantern light. I was delivering grain to the storehouse when I saw you writing those accusations against her." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. The young man's words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Elder Abram's own fields yielded barely half what they should have, Samuel revealed, his voice growing steadier with each word. Yet he blamed the poor harvest on Miriam's presence among us, calling her cursed when his own negligence was to blame. Jonas stood beside Miriam, his hand finding hers in silent support. The mountain man's eyes never left Samuel, recognizing the tremendous risk the farmhand was taking. He forged testimony from 3 families who weren't even present during the bread sharing, Samuel continued. I watched him practice their signatures before adding them to the council documents. Ruth pushed forward from the crowd, her face contorted with indignation. "This boy knows nothing. He's always had eyes for the widow." "Is that true?" someone called out from the gathering. Samuel's shoulders straightened. "I admire Miriam for her kindness and skill, yes, but I speak now because what's happening isn't just." He turned to face the entire community. "While we struggled this winter, I saw Elder Abram hide grain in his cellar rather than share with those in need." The council members exchanged troubled glances. Naomi, seated among the women, nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally coming together. "The accusations against this couple are built on lies," Samuel concluded, his voice now steady and clear. "I may not be brave enough to stand against our ways as Jonas has done, but I cannot remain silent while injustice wears the mask of tradition." The mood in the hall transformed. Whispers spread like wildfire. Community members, who moments ago had been ready to condemn, now looked uncertainly toward their leaders. Some nodded in agreement with the farmhand's words, while others moved closer to Miriam and Jonas in silent support. Elder Abram's face had turned ashen, his authority visibly crumbling under the weight of Samuel's testimony. The tide had turned, and everyone in the hall could feel it. Justice, long delayed, was finally finding its voice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the council hall as Elder Abram cleared his throat, his face a mask of forced composure. The crowd pressed in from all sides, their collective breath held in anticipation. Samuel's testimony hung in the air like morning mist, impossible to ignore, yet difficult to grasp in its implications. "The council has deliberated," Elder Abram announced, each word seemingly pulled from him against his will. His eyes avoided Miriam's steady gaze. "We find no grounds to deny the lawfulness of Jonas and Miriam's union." A ripple of whispers swept through the gathered villagers. Miriam stood tall in her simple dress, no longer just a widow, but a woman vindicated. Beside her, Jonas shifted his weight from one foot to another, unaccustomed to being the center of such attention, yet unwavering in his stance. "Let it be recorded," continued the elder, "that their household is recognized within our community." He paused, then added with subtle emphasis, "provided they maintain adherence to the ordning in all other matters." Naomi, standing near the front, nodded approvingly, her weathered hands clasped before her. The older woman caught Miriam's eye and offered a small, satisfied smile. This was no small victory. It represented a shift in the very foundation of their community's judgment. Ruth lingered at the edges of the gathering, her face a complex mixture of resentment and reluctant acceptance. The rescue of her child had left her indebted to the couple she had worked so hard to ostracize. Now, with the council's declaration, her campaign against them had officially failed. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel approached Miriam and Jonas. The young farmhand's cheeks flushed with color, but his eyes shone with quiet pride. "I only spoke the truth," he said simply. Miriam reached out and squeezed his hand. Sometimes truth is the bravest gift one can offer. The three of them walked out into the spring sunshine, where several community members nodded in acknowledgement. Not yet warm embraces, but a far cry from the cruel laughter that had once followed Miriam through the marketplace. That evening, as they walked the path back to their mountain home, Jonas finally broke his thoughtful silence. "I never thought I'd stand before the council," he admitted. "Never thought I'd have reason to." Miriam took his calloused hand in hers. "And I never thought I'd stand there with dignity again." The cedar cabin awaited them, no longer a place of exile, but a home recognized by their community. Though some resentment would linger like winter frost in shadowed corners, a sense of justice had prevailed. The couple, once objects of mockery and whispers, had found not just each other, but their rightful place among their people. The earth yielded to Miriam's hands as she knelt in the freshly tilled soil, guiding the women of the village in proper seed spacing. Her quilt of doves, once hidden away, now hung prominently on the weathered barn wall overlooking the planting fields, a silent guardian over their labor. The women, many who had once turned away from her in the marketplace, now sought her wisdom on herbs and growing seasons. "Plant them with prayer," she instructed a young mother, demonstrating how to nestle bean seeds into the dark soil. "The earth remembers kindness." Across the field, Jonas moved among the men, his tall figure no longer drawing snickers but respectful nods. The mountain man, who had once been mocked for his isolation, now shared hunting knowledge with younger farmers, his quiet confidence a stark contrast to his former awkwardness. When their eyes met across the rows of freshly planted corn, a wordless understanding passed between them, pride in what they had built together from the ashes of ridicule. Elder Abram stood at the field's edge, his authority diminished but not destroyed. The elder watched as Miriam's influence spread through the community like the roots of the crops they planted. Though his lips remained tight with disapproval, Even he could not deny the abundance that seemed to follow in her wake. "Your bread for the midday meal?" Ruth approached Miriam, her voice softer than it had been in seasons past. The sister-in-law who had once been her fiercest accuser now held out an olive branch, however tentative. "There's enough for everyone," Miriam replied, rising from the soil and brushing earth from her apron. The widow's recipe, once whispered about with suspicion, was now requested at every community gathering. By noon, families gathered under the shade of maple trees, breaking bread together. Naomi sat beside Miriam, the older woman's eyes crinkling with satisfaction. "They see you now," she whispered, nodding toward the villagers who laughed and talked freely in their presence. Samuel approached with a wooden cup of water for Miriam. "The eastern field has the best yield we've seen in 3 springs," he reported, his former timidity replaced by the confidence of a man who had found his voice. As the sun began its westward journey, Jonas found Miriam among the women. He stood beside her, no longer the virgin of the mountain, but a husband whose love had been forged in the fire of community scorn. His calloused hand found hers. Together they surveyed the planted fields, rows of future harvest stretching toward the horizon. "They will sing about this planting season," Jonas said quietly. Miriam smiled, remembering how her voice had once silenced mockery at the barn raising. "Let them sing," she replied. "We have planted more than seeds today." The morning dew still clung to the fields as Naomi gathered the women beneath the old oak tree. The planting season's final day had arrived, and an air of anticipation hung over the assembled group. Miriam stood among them, no longer at the edges, but welcomed at the center, her hands still bearing the soil of honest work. "There is something you must know," Naomi announced, her weathered face solemn yet bright with purpose. "The bread that has sustained us through winter holds more than flour and water." The elder woman reached for Miriam's hand, drawing her forward. "Our sister has preserved what many thought lost, the healing herb our grandmothers once called heaven's whisper." A collective gasp rose from the circle. The herb was legendary, said to bring fertility to barren fields and peace to troubled hearts. For generations, it had been thought extinct, a casualty of modern farming and forgotten ways. "I found it growing wild near the cedar cabin," Miriam explained softly. "I didn't know its significance until Naomi recognized its scent in my bread." Her voice, once silenced by shame, now carried across the gathering with quiet authority. Ruth pushed forward, her face a complex mixture of disbelief and dawning respect. "Is this why my youngest recovered so quickly after the blizzard? Your bread?" Miriam nodded, offering no judgment for past cruelties. "The herb strengthens both body and spirit. My grandmother taught me to recognize it, though I never knew how rare it had become." From the edge of the field, Jonas watched with undisguised pride. The mountain man who had once been mocked as untouched by women now stood tall beside the wagon he had built with his own hands. Children who had once hidden from his gaze now crowded around him, eager for stories of wilderness survival. Elder Abram approached slowly, humility evident in his measured steps. "The Ordnung teaches that God speaks through unexpected vessels," he acknowledged. "Perhaps we were too quick to judge what we did not understand." By midday, the planting was complete. Women who had once whispered cruel jokes behind Miriam's back now sought her counsel on herbs and healing. Men who had laughed at Jonas's awkward ways now recognized the strength in his silence. As the sun began its descent, the community gathered for a meal in the open field. Miriam's bread was passed from hand to hand, each piece received as a blessing rather than mere sustenance. "From rejection to revelation," Naomi whispered, watching as the widow and her mountain man moved among their neighbors, no longer outcasts, but bearers of unexpected grace. The laughter that filled the valley that evening was not the cruel mockery of before, but the joyful sound of a community transformed, not by miracle alone, but by the enduring power of resilience, forgiveness, and love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places.